Hello, and welcome to Abilities United Presents Community Connections, a program dedicated to those individuals living with a developmental or physical challenge. I'm Andrea Throndson, Community Connections Developer. Tonight we have a very special program. We will be talking with an expert on autism. Rick Rollens is a parent advocate and co-founder of the UC Davis M.I.N.D Institute. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you.
Before we get started, can you so many people hear the word autistic, autism, but what's a definition that we can all understand?
Well, autism was first described in the medical literature in the 1940s, and it's been with us since that point. There's a definition of autism in something called the DSM-4, which is the diagnostic manual used for psychiatric illnesses. Autism is a spectrum of disorders, we know, and it's a brain-based organic disease.
So when you think of disabilities as a whole, where does autism fit on that spectrum?
Well, autism is defined as a developmental disability. It's one of the most pervasive developmental disabilities currently in society. It's a serious debilitating disability on the more severe end, and on the higher functioning end, it can also present some very serious social interaction issues for individuals who have autism.
Right. So when you think of when I think of a person with, say, Down syndrome or something, I get a mental image in my head. Is there any characteristic of autism that you would recognize?
Well, one of the challenges with autism is that we know that now, with the work that's being done at the M.I.N.D Institute and other institutions around the country, that we're really not looking at a single disorder. And no two people with autism are the same, just as two people with a cancer are not the same. We know, for instance, that the etiology or how people develop autism may very well be different, with some folks having a strong genetic predisposition for the development of autism, others who maybe have encountered environmental factors that may have caused the condition. Right now, the problem is that we look at it as a behavioral disability, and we know, though, that there's some serious medical issues that are involved in the development of autism as well.
Wow. So it used to be that when you said someone had cancer, you just think cancer, and that's a generic, term used for that. And like autism, you think autism, that's one word and one definition, but what I hear you saying is it can be very different depending on the individual.
Absolutely. I think, when my son was diagnosed with autism about 18 years ago, and I told people my son had autism, the point of reference for autism was the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman.
Right.
And unfortunately, the character that Dustin Hoffman portrayed in Rain Man really represents about 1/100th of 1% of all people with autism, the autistic savant. So it's really sort of Hollywood's version of putting a face on autism that really wasn't accurate in representing people with autism.
Right. Boy, you really have to, you don't know what the world has put out there, to see. You've really got to be discretionary to understand what it really is.
That's right, and I think, this condition's been around for quite some time. We have some extremely good diagnosticians here in California at the University of California, San Francisco, and Stanford University right here in your backyard, who do a tremendous job at diagnosing autism. It's, as I mentioned, a very pervasive condition, and in fact, parents of children with autism literally can diagnose the disorder in the more severe cases across an airport.
Wow.
It's once you've encountered someone with what we call full syndrome autism, you never forget that.
You never forget it.
You never forget it.
Wow, boy, they've come a long way, which we'll talk more about.
Absolutely.
Tell me, you've got a fascinating story. Can you give me a little bit of your own history and what happened with your son and so forth?
Yeah, I live in Sacramento. I worked in the California legislature for 24 years. I was Secretary of the Senate.
Oh, wow.
My son was born in 1990 and was diagnosed at 17 months old with full syndrome autism. And it changed my life, it changed my family's life, and I decided to resign my position in 1996 from the Senate in order to dedicate myself to doing work on the autism front. I am responsible for something called the California Report, which was the first report ever done that documented the dramatic increase in autism here in California, which really sort of touched off the entire global awareness about autism being such a pervasive condition.
Right. When you say a big leap, what are we talking about?
Well, 25, 30 years ago, autism, the prevalence of autism was about 5 to 10 children in 10,000. Today it's about 1 in 150, 1 in 100.
Oh,
and we're seeing such a rapid increase in this disorder that 3% of the intakes into our developmental services system in California used to be cases of autism. Today that number is 65%. We're adding on average about 13 new kids a day, 7 days a week, with the most severe forms of autism into our regional center system, which provides services to people with developmental disabilities.
So I mean, those are practically astronomical numbers.
They
I mean,
are.
what do they say? Is there research done on why those numbers are so high?
Well, 10, 12 years ago when I first started sort of really getting on this in a big way and being kind of like the Paul Revere in the autism community, waving my hands and jumping up and down and saying there's an epidemic of these kids. We need to start planning for these children. And I was kind of turned away, quite frankly, by mainstream medicine and science, who basically said, oh, we're just better at diagnosing these kids. And, you know, you meet someone like my son, and trust me, missing a child or a person with full syndrome autism is like missing a forest fire. You just don't miss these.
You just don't miss
these kids. So it was kind of a ludicrous argument that I had to continue to battle for a long, long time. And I'm glad to report that today most thinking people in mainstream medicine and science agree that there's been a true increase in the prevalence and incidence of autism, not only here in California, but throughout the country and throughout the developing world.
Wow. So do they think that it's genetic or environmental, a little bit of both? Or?
Well, what's real interesting, in the early days, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and into the 1970s, the cause of autism was laid at the feet of what was known as the refrigerator mother. This was a mother who had a child who was a cold, uncaring person, and this child then turned into this autistic child in order to get back at the mother for being a cold refrigerator mother. Now, as absolutely asinine and repugnant as that sounds, that theory of the cause of autism went through mainstream medicine and science for 3 or 4 decades before the myth was finally dispelled. In the meantime, the carnage that it caused among families, and for me as a parent of a child with autism, I often wonder if that theory had been put down early in its process, where we'd be today in finding out the causes of autism and not laying at the feet of a cold, uncaring mother. So we went from that into the 1970s to the idea that there was an autism gene out there. There was one gene that caused autism.
Caused you to get autistic.
Right. Well, that theory holds up for a while when the prevalence is at 3% in the population. When it's 65% of intakes, it doesn't. And clearly there's no one single gene that causes autism, nor do we believe today that there's one type of autism. Again, at the M.I.N.D Institute, the word autisms is used because we believe that there's a number of different etiologies or causes of autism, and we've basically, like in the old days with cancer, everyone had cancer. Now you have colorectal cancer, you have breast cancer, you have throat cancer, all of those things.
Wow.